One of my viewers shoved this article in my face. He told me, this is proof that Kyle Rittenhouse is guilty. Indisputable. This is by a professor of history. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm in serious trouble here. This has probably got the facts, well cited, solid reasoning behind it. And it's going to destroy all my claims about Kyle. Yeah, not quite. And in fact, we're going to read this and have a good laugh. Hello out there. I am trying to get through.
With his powerful brainwaves cradled in the warmth of reasoning, it's time for Johnny Walker Dredd to straighten you out on a thing or two. Emanating all the way from exciting Las Vegas, Oklahoma, it's the Johnny Walker Dredd Show.
All right, the title is The Long and Sinister History Behind the Rittenhouse Acquittal, and it's by Rutgers history professor Norman Markovitz. Now let's take a look at his background here. Here's his page at Rutgers Department of History. Associate professor of history. Now, he got his PhD at the University of Michigan in 1970, and he's only an associate professor? How does that happen? How is it that you can't get promoted to a full professor in that length of time? I don't know. But let's take a look here. He's been at Rutgers since 1971, and he's still just an associate professor. Maybe being a full professor violates some sort of Marxist communist principles or something. I don't know. His research interests. My work is in 20th century U.S. political history. I write and teach from a Marxist perspective, and I have written in recent years many articles for the History News Service, the History News Network, the journal Political Affairs, and various encyclopedias, whatever. What kind of courses has he taught? He teaches a course 506, History of Socialism and Communism. Another course, History of Imperialism. Gee, I wonder what side of the political fence he sits. And also he teaches U.S. history, not only from 1914 to 1945, but from 1945 to present. And that means that if your kid is getting a degree at Rutgers, he's probably in this dude's history class, because this is a general education history class being taught by a communist. So I looked him up on Professor Watch List. This is a web page that kind of alerts people to radical nut jobs that are teaching your kids at the university. So if you're ever interested, you ought to check this thing out. And here is his profile. Professor of history at Rutgers. He writes and teaches about communism using his Marxist perspective. Enormous respect for Howard Zinn, who's a Marxist historian. By the way, Howard Zinn sort of rewrote our history textbooks from a communist perspective, and it is used in a lot of our universities. Oh, by the way, another admirer for Howard Zinn, Bruce Springsteen. Yep. So we go back to the article authored by Norman Markovitz. And by the way, this is published in, guess what? The online blog Communist Party USA. He wrote this for Communist Party USA. That should tell you about his political angle. He is a communist, and he is a professor of history at Rutgers, and he teaches the introductory history classes at Rutgers. So before people tell you that, oh, this idea somehow that our history professors are all a bunch of communists, there you go. He's one of them. Indisputable proof that they do exist. But let's get back to this article, and I know it's going to have to be good. He is a history professor. He's going to have great citations. He's going to back everything up with solid arguments. Let's check it out. Oh, I also should note that this was authored on December 10th, 2021, a few weeks after the trial of Kyle Rittenhouse ended. All right, and so it begins. A jury in Kenosha, Wisconsin on November 19th acquitted Kyle Rittenhouse, who was 17 years old when he murdered two unarmed men. Notice he uses the term murdered. Oh yeah, this is going to be a very fair article, unbiased. Murdered two unarmed men and wounded a third. Rittenhouse was participating in armed groups of volunteers, and I don't know why he put volunteers in quotes, because that's what they were doing. They were, in fact, volunteering to aid the police and protect property. And he puts protect property in quotes, but that's what they were doing. I mean, there's no doubt about that. Even the Kyle Rittenhouse haters admit that he was protecting property. They just don't think he should have been doing it. So, protect property from people protesting the shooting of Jacob Blake. Blake was, oh, get this. Blake was an unarmed African-American man shot 7 times by police as he got into his car. Keep in mind that he was not unarmed. He had a knife. He was carrying a knife. We have a picture of it, and he admitted to carrying a knife. But he describes Blake as unarmed. This is a historian, a history professor. So he was shot 7 times by police as he got into his car. It wasn't his car. It was his ex-wife's car. He took it without her permission. In all effects, he was stealing it, or at the very least, using it without her permission. It was not his car. Again, history professor. And sought to take his children away following a domestic disturbance with the children's mother. Well, now, wait a minute. You have a domestic disturbance with the mother, but it takes 2 people to have a disturbance. Gee, I wonder who the other person was. All right, globally, this was seen as yet another example of American racism, or systemic racism, the term which the Black Lives Matter movement brought into the mass media. Well, no, they introduced it to the mass media, but whatever. I'm not going to nitpick the word choice here. However, I will nitpick the fact that he says globally this was seen as yet another example. That's an unsubstantiated claim. That's called truth by blatant assertion. You can't just make statements like that without providing some justification for them. For example, maybe there are some world leaders who commented on the Rittenhouse trial or something. This is where you would write that. But there's nothing here. He just makes the claim. Again, history professor. In the U.S., conservatives of all kinds continue to contend that racism had nothing to do with the Rittenhouse shooting, since all 3 of the men shot by Rittenhouse were white, and that's a pretty good contention. I mean, think about it. And that's a pretty rock-solid argument. But that's okay. I mean, his whole deal here is he's going to unravel that thinking. Liberals and progressives of all kinds have blamed racism for the decision. That doesn't mean that the decision was racist just because they claim it. But we move on. And the complicity of both the Kenosha police and the larger judicial system in bringing about an acquittal, which, given the context in which the killings took place, made Rittenhouse's self-defense argument absurd. Okay, we're going to claim that Kyle Rittenhouse's self-defense argument is absurd. Well, that's going to require, guess what? Evidence. You're going to have to show that his argument was absurd. And is he going to do that? No, he's not. From this point on, this article is going to veer very far away from the Rittenhouse trial and is never going to be able to come back and provide anything to substantiate the claim that Kyle was guilty. Again, truth by blatant assertion. Just say it, and if you say it, it must be true. There's no doubt that had Rittenhouse been an African-American man carrying a weapon at a conservative rally, the self-defense law on which Rittenhouse's acquittal was based would not have been considered by a nearly all-white jury. Again, unsubstantiated claim. There's no doubt that, indeed, a trial would not have occurred because of the likelihood that an armed black man would be shot dead by the police. What about Corey Ali Muhammad? In Fresno, he opened fire on 4 white people because they were white. He said it. killed all 4 of them, and they took them alive. So how can you look at that incident and then come back and say that Kyle would have certainly been killed by the police? In fact, this whole notion that if Kyle had been black, things would have been different is just pure conjecture. It's based on nothing. And one thing that pisses me off about Kyle Rittenhouse's supporters is that they allow the anti-Kyles to make these kind of statements without pushing back on them. This is conjecture. It's worthless. Finally, the reactionary and neo-fascist forces inside and outside the Republican Party have hailed Rittenhouse as a hero and a model. Whatever. This is reminiscent of the praise accorded Nazi stormtroopers. Yeah, that's Kyle. He's a Nazi stormtrooper. Who were either acquitted or given short sentences for their crimes during the Weimar Republic. Okay, I'll pronounce it Weimar. How should we communists, Marxists of all kinds, and the broad left look at these events, and what should we call for? Here he is saying, how should we communists and Marxists? He's telling you he's a communist. Don't give me any crap that just because he teaches a course on communism that he's not. He's telling you, and he's writing for Communist Party USA. No doubt about it, guys. As a historian, oh my, a historian. We really got to give him a lot of credibility here, right? No, let's go ahead and read on. As a historian, let me present my views to our readers. Why are you asking for permission? As a historian, let me present my views. Who's stopping you? Dude, just say it. What we should say is, well, no, we're not going to let you present your views. Sorry. Who writes like this? All right. Armed vigilante groups have a long history that includes attacks on workers' movements and especially racist oppression and repression. Before the Civil War, the number of official police was small because the slaveholder class did not want to pay for them. Actually, the number of police pretty much all over the world was small at that time. Slave patrols were widely used to capture escaped slaves, especially after 1831, when Nat Turner's rebellion, the most important slave rebellion in U.S. history, terrified the slaveholder class. And this has what to do with Kyle Rittenhouse? Okay, we're just going to have to read on, aren't we? Abolitionists in the South were often driven out by such patrols and their homes burned. Well, if you drive them out, why do you have to burn their houses now? I mean, they're no longer there. Kind of odd. Maybe he meant to say driven out or their homes burned. In the North, armed vigilantes, often supported by wealthy merchant capitalists and bankers, attacked abolitionist newspapers and mobbed and sometimes murdered abolitionist activists. True, but what does this have to do with Kyle Rittenhouse? Well, we just continue on here. After the Civil War, the KKK, in effect, fought a guerrilla war of terror and murdered to restore as much as they could the defeated slaveholder Confederacy. And by the way, is this starting to sound like a high school essay? It really does. It is important to remember that while their primary targets were former slaves fighting for citizenship rights, they also focused their attacks on Southern whites who supported emancipation, whom they called scalawags. I don't think I've ever heard the term scalawag used that way, but okay. Northerners working for the Freedmen's Bureau, the first government social services agency in U.S. history, which sought to aid the former slaves in their transition to citizenship and freedom, were special targets. These Northerners were called carpetbaggers by the Klan terrorists. No, a carpetbagger is not these people working for the Freedmen's Bureau. Carpetbaggers were poor Northerners who moved down into the South to take advantage of a war-torn region, because regions that are tore up by war are often easy to take advantage of. You can buy up property really cheap. Any kind of defeated people are going to be easy to take advantage of, and these people were called carpetbaggers. I cannot believe a historian doesn't know that. The century following the Civil War saw the defeat of the struggle to democratize the former slaves and the establishment, with the support of the federal government, of a system of segregation and disenfranchisement of blacks called Jim Crow. Okay, what's the relationship to Kyle? This turned the former slave states, a largely underdeveloped region, into a center for a reserve army of cheap labor, both white and black. And these are the people that Kyle shot? I hope so, because I'm really losing the connection here. All right, move on. The Klan and its many imitators continued their acts of terror, including lynching and murder, often with support of local police and judiciary. As the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, a leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, along with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., would say in the late 1950s, the police and the Klan were often the same people. Kyle is not a member of the police. What is the connection here? Move on. The Klan is not a relic of history. It kind of is. There's not very many people left in it. It operated as an armed force through the 1960s, and individual Klansmen committed bombings, shootings, and murders in the 1970s and 1980s. All right, 40 years ago. Whatever. Today, about 30 independent Klan chapters are scattered across the country, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. Nor were these armed volunteer vigilante groups used only to maintain a racist power structure. He keeps putting volunteer in quotes. It's used correctly. These were volunteers. They weren't paid. With the rapid industrialization that followed the Civil War, they were recruited by factory owners and corporations to attack strikers, and were often deputized by local police and politicians to do their dirty work. Okay, so they're attacking strikers, people who don't want to work, to try to fight for higher wages. However you feel about that, it has nothing to do with Kyle Rittenhouse. None of the people that were involved in the shootings were striking. This dude can't seem to focus. If you're going to make a claim that Kyle Rittenhouse's shooting of JoJo Rosenbaum was motivated as part of some sort of racist deal, why are you talking about attacks on strikers? Okay, this is where it gets really strange. In the 1930s, the novelist John Steinbeck famously called them pool room patriots and portrayed them as auxiliaries to police brutality in his classic novel, The Grapes of Wrath, which dealt with white tenant farmers fleeing the Dust Bowl in the midst of the Great Depression. Now, I've read The Grapes of Wrath. I don't recall ever hearing anything about a pool room patriot. So I decided to go online to see what this was all about. So I typed in Google, pool room patriot, and it says, did not match any documents. So let's try patriots. That shouldn't matter too much. And it says, it looks like there aren't many great matches for your search. It found one, the article that we're reading. So let's try Pool Room Patriots Grapes of Wrath. Here's the full text of The Grapes of Wrath. Let's take a look. And guess what? I type in pool room and I get 0 hits. The full text of The Grapes of Wrath, the term pool room does not show up anywhere. And yet, let's go back to what he said. In the 1930s, the novelist John Steinbeck famously called them pool room patriots. How famously could he have called them if it doesn't even show up in the text of the book? And when we do a Google search, we can't find it. This is a history professor writing this. He has a PhD. He's making shit up. In 1964, as the most important civil rights act of the 20th century was enacted, 3 civil rights workers who were engaged in the voter registration campaign known as Mississippi Summer were murdered by Klan killers with the knowledge and complicity of local authorities. Terrible thing. What's the connection to Kyle Rittenhouse? In this case, another high-profile racist murders It was decades before there was even a semblance of justice. Okay. All right, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to finish off with another video because I'm getting a little tired and I'm making a lot of mistakes and it's going to cost me a lot of time in editing. So stay tuned for more. Like my video and subscribe to my channel.